The wrench slipped from Jake Morrison's oil-stained fingers as the voice echoed through his silent garage. "Dad! Dad!" But Emma was 20 miles away at school, and Jake lived alone in this forgotten corner of Millbrook, Indiana. The afternoon light painted golden streaks across rusted tools and broken dreams. Small bare feet slapped against the cold concrete, growing louder, more urgent. A 6-year-old stranger with sun-bleached hair burst through the doorway, her chest rising and falling like a frightened bird. She clutched something against her heart, something that made Jake's blood turn to ice. The child's eyes held secrets too heavy for her age, and when she smiled, it was Sarah's smile looking back at him. Sarah, who had been buried beneath the old oak tree for exactly 731 days. The bracelet in the little girl's trembling hand was impossible because Jake had buried the only one like it with his wife. But what this mysterious child would reveal about Sarah's hidden past would shatter everything Jake thought he knew about love, loss, and second chances. Jake Morrison had built his life around routines that kept the ghosts at bay. Wake at 6, coffee black, work until Emma came home from school. Dinner for 2 at the scratched wooden table Sarah had painted yellow during her last spring. The garage behind their small house had become his sanctuary and his prison, filled with broken engines and memories that refused to stay buried. 2 years ago, when the cancer finally won, Sarah had made him promise to keep living, not just surviving, but actually living. Jake had nodded and held her hand and meant every word. But promises made to the dying are harder to keep than anyone realizes. The little girl stood perfectly still in his doorway, studying him with eyes too knowing for someone so young. Her sundress was wrinkled like she had been running for hours, and her bare feet were dirty from the gravel road. But it was the bracelet that held Jake's attention. Thin rope twisted into intricate patterns, exactly like the ones Sarah used to make during her chemotherapy sessions. Her fingers had needed something to do while the poison dripped into her veins, and she had created dozens of these small masterpieces. Jake had buried them all with her, every single one, because he could not bear to see them in a world without her hands to make them. "Can you fix anything?" the child asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had already learned that most things stayed broken. Jake crawled out from under the Ford, his knees protesting against the concrete floor. Oil streaked his forearms like war paint, and his grey t-shirt bore the stains of 1,000 repair jobs. He was 35, but felt twice that age, carved hollow by grief and the daily effort of pretending normalcy for Emma's sake. The child stepped closer, unafraid of his silence or his sighs, or the tools scattered around him like metallic bones. "Depends what's broken," Jake said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. The words felt strange in his mouth. He had not spoken to anyone except Emma and the occasional customer in weeks. The child held up the bracelet, and Jake's world tilted sideways. Up close, he could see every detail Sarah's fingers had known by heart. The specific way she twisted the final knot, the small imperfection where she always pulled too tight, the faint discoloration from where she had spilled tea during one particularly difficult treatment. This was not just similar to Sarah's work. This was Sarah's work. "My mom said you could fix this," the little girl whispered, and Jake felt something crack open inside his chest. Behind her, a woman emerged from the shadows of late afternoon, moving with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world quietly. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that spoke of careful budgeting rather than poverty. Her eyes found Jake's across the distance between them, and in that moment he saw recognition flash like lightning. She knew who he was. Somehow, impossibly, she knew exactly who he was. But Jake had never seen this woman before in his life, and the questions multiplying in his head threatened to drown out everything else. Clare Matthews had driven 17 hours straight to reach this small garage in Millbrook, following directions written in handwriting she had memorized but never seen in person. Her daughter Lily had slept for most of the journey, curled in the passenger seat with the precious bracelet clutched against her chest like a talisman. Clare had tried a dozen times to explain why they were making this trip, but how do you tell a 6-year-old that her entire future might depend on a stranger's kindness? How do you explain that sometimes salvation comes disguised as coincidence, and that some roads only reveal themselves when you are desperate enough to walk them? The moving truck had arrived that morning to take away the last pieces of Clare's old life. The Manhattan apartment with its white walls and designer furniture. The closet full of curator-appropriate clothing that cost more per item than most people spent on groceries. The life she had built so carefully, so deliberately, brick by expensive brick. But careful lives can crumble just as easily as careless ones, and Clare had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Now she owned exactly what fit in her 10-year-old Honda Civic, and she was betting everything on the words of a woman she had never met, but who had somehow understood her better than anyone ever had. Jake studied the woman and child before him, his mechanic's mind automatically cataloguing details. The woman's hands showed no calluses, but her nails were short and practical. Her shoes were expensive but worn, like she had been walking farther than they were designed for. The child clung to her mother's leg with the unconscious desperation of someone who had learned that people could disappear without warning. Most telling of all was the way the woman's eyes kept darting to the corners of the garage, taking inventory of his life with the trained observation of someone who understood the weight of possessions. "I'm Clare," the woman said, her voice carrying the faint echo of education and cities. "This is Lily. We're new in town." The pause before those last words carried volumes, and Jake recognized the careful omission of someone who had left more behind than they cared to explain. He had become an expert in reading the spaces between words, the things people did not say when the truth was too heavy for casual conversation. Clare's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse, withdrawing a folded piece of paper worn soft from handling. "Sarah Morrison gave me your address," Clare said, and the garage fell silent except for the distant hum of afternoon traffic. Jake's vision tunneled until the only thing in focus was the paper in Clare's hands. Sarah had been dead for 2 years. Sarah had never left Millbrook in her entire life. Sarah had certainly never met this sophisticated stranger with her city clothes and careful speech. But the paper Clare held was definitely in Sarah's handwriting. Jake would recognize those careful loops and determined straight lines anywhere. He had saved every grocery list, every love note, every prescription reminder Sarah had ever written, storing them in a shoebox under his bed, like relics of a more hopeful time. The letter was brief, written on hospital stationery in the blue ink Sarah preferred. "If you ever find yourself lost," it read, "look for Jake Morrison on Maple Street in Millbrook, Indiana. He fixes more than just cars, though he doesn't know it yet. Tell him Sarah sent you, and that some promises take longer to keep than others." At the bottom, Sarah had drawn a small sketch of a rope bracelet, every detail perfect down to the twisted knot pattern. Jake's hands shook as he read the words again, trying to make sense of a message from beyond the grave. How had Sarah known this woman? When had she written this letter? And why had she never mentioned any of it to him? Clare watched Jake's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. She had rehearsed this moment during the long drive from New York, but reality was messier than any script she could have imagined. The garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust, and something indefinably masculine that made her think of her father's workshop from childhood. Tools hung on pegboards with the obsessive organization of someone who found comfort in knowing exactly where everything belonged. In one corner, a child's drawing was taped to the wall, a stick figure family under a yellow sun, signed Emma in crayon letters. "I don't understand," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah never mentioned you. She never... How did you know her?" Claire pulled a second paper from her purse, this one crisp and official-looking. It was a certificate from St. Mary's Hospital in Indianapolis, documenting Sarah Morrison's participation in their art therapy correspondence program. During the final months of her treatment, Sarah had been paired with cancer patients from around the country, sharing encouragement and creative projects through the mail. Claire's name was listed as her assigned partner, along with dates that corresponded to Sarah's last 3 months of life. The revelation hit Jake like cold water. While he had been focused on doctors and treatment schedules and the impossible task of keeping hope alive, Sarah had been building a secret friendship with a stranger in New York. She had never mentioned the correspondence program, never hinted that she was sharing their story with someone else. The betrayal felt fresh and sharp, mixed with something that might have been relief. Sarah had not faced those final weeks entirely alone. She had found someone to listen to her fears, someone to understand the weight of leaving behind a husband and daughter who needed her so desperately. "She wrote about you," Claire said softly, pulling Jake back from his spiraling thoughts. "About Emma, about this garage and how you could fix anything except the one thing that mattered most. She was worried about what would happen to you both after she was gone. She made me promise that if I ever needed help, I would come here. And if you ever needed help, I would try to give it." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, loaded with implications Jake was not prepared to consider. Lily tugged on her mother's hand, tired of adult conversations she could not follow. "Can we stay, Mama?" she asked, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a child who had been transplanted too many times. "I like it here. It smells like Grandpa's house." Claire's face tightened with emotions Jake could not read, but he caught the shadow of loss that crossed her features. Another story there, another catalogue of grief he was not ready to hear. But the child's simple request reminded him of his manners, of the person Sarah had always insisted he could be when he stopped hiding behind his tools and his silence. "You can stay for dinner," Jake heard himself saying, though he had no idea what he was going to feed 3 people or how he was going to explain any of this to Emma. "Nothing fancy. Just dinner." Claire's smile was like sunrise after a long winter, transforming her tired face into something radiant. Lily clapped her hands and began exploring the garage with the fearless curiosity of childhood, touching tools and asking questions about their purposes. For the first time in 731 days, Jake's garage felt alive with possibility instead of weighted with memory. Emma Morrison burst through the garage door at 4:30 sharp, her backpack hitting the floor with the particular violence of someone who had survived another day of 4th grade. She was 8 years old and wise beyond her years, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn chin. The sight of strangers in their sacred space should have alarmed her, but instead she studied Clare and Lily with the calculating intelligence she had inherited from both parents. After 2 years of watching her father navigate the world like a ghost, Emma had learned to recognize the difference between people who stayed and people who disappeared. "Dad, who are these people?" Emma asked, with the directness that made Jake proud and terrified in equal measure. She had never learned the art of polite small talk, never developed the filters that most children acquired through social osmosis. Loss had made her practical in ways that broke Jake's heart, but it had also made her fearless in ways he envied. She walked directly to Lily and introduced herself with the confidence of someone who understood that friendship was too precious to waste on ceremony. "I'm Emma. This is my dad's garage. He fixes cars and sometimes he fixes people, but he pretends he doesn't know how to do that second part." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks at his daughter's casual observation, but Clare's laugh was warm and genuine. Lily whispered her own introduction, suddenly shy in the presence of another child who seemed so self-assured. Within minutes, they were examining the bracelet together, Lily explaining its history while Emma listened with the serious attention she reserved for things that mattered. Clare watched the children connect with the bittersweet recognition of someone who remembered when making friends was that simple. Her own childhood had been carefully orchestrated playdates and structured activities, supervised interactions designed to build social capital rather than genuine connection. Watching Lily's face light up as Emma showed her the treasure box of interesting bolts and washers Jake kept for emergencies, Clare felt something ease in her chest. Perhaps this desperate gamble might actually work. Perhaps Sarah Morrison had known something about healing that Clare was only beginning to understand. The evening that followed was the closest thing to normal Jake had experienced in 2 years. Clare proved surprisingly capable in the kitchen, transforming his meager pantry supplies into something that resembled an actual meal. She moved through his space with careful respect, asking permission before opening cabinets, apologizing for the intrusion even as she made herself useful. The children chattered through dinner with the easy intimacy of old friends, sharing stories and jokes that made Jake remember what laughter sounded like in his house. But normalcy was a fragile thing, and Jake found himself studying Clare for clues about her real intentions. People did not drive 17 hours to share dinner with strangers, no matter what letters the dead had written. Her clothes spoke of money and education, but her careful way of portioning food suggested someone who had learned not to waste anything. When Lily asked for seconds, Clare's hesitation was so brief, Jake almost missed it. The calculation of someone weighing hunger against resources, abundance against uncertainty. The arrangement that developed over the following week was surprisingly natural. Clare proved to be genuinely helpful, taking over meal preparation with a skill that suggested professional training, or at least extensive practice. She was quietly efficient with household tasks, fixing small problems Jake had been ignoring for months, and organizing spaces with an eye for both function and beauty. But it was her interaction with Emma that convinced Jake to extend their stay indefinitely. Clare treated Emma like a complete person rather than a child to be managed, asking her opinions and respecting her answers with a sincerity that made Emma bloom like a flower finding sunlight. She listened to Emma's stories about school and friends and the complicated social dynamics of 4th grade with the same attention she might give to adult conversation. Most importantly, she never tried to replace Sarah or fill the mother-shaped hole in Emma's life. Instead, she created something new and different, a friendship that honored what had been lost while making space for what might be found. But Jake's growing comfort with Clare's presence was complicated by the mystery of her background. She never received phone calls or mail, never mentioned friends or family members, never referenced the life she had left behind in New York. When casual conversation touched on her past, she redirected with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to navigate around dangerous topics. The expensive watch she wore was at odds with her careful budgeting, and the way she flinched at unexpected noises suggested experiences Jake preferred not to imagine. The revelation came by accident, 3 weeks after Clare and Lily's arrival. Jake had been working late in the garage when he heard raised voices from the house. Not an argument, but something that made him drop his tools and move quickly toward the sound. He found Clare in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and fierce with an anger Jake had never seen from her. "You have no right to threaten my daughter," Clare was saying, her free hand gripping the kitchen counter until her knuckles went white. "The custody agreement is clear. I have full legal guardianship, and there is nothing you can do to change that. Stop calling me. Stop trying to track us down. We are done." She ended the call and stood perfectly still for a long moment, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Jake cleared his throat softly to announce his presence, and Clare spun around with the startled reflexes of someone who had learned to expect attacks from unexpected directions. When she saw it was only Jake, relief flooded her features, followed immediately by embarrassment at being caught in a moment of vulnerability. But the fear in her eyes was real and immediate, transforming her from mysterious guest to someone in genuine need of protection. "Ex-husband?" Jake asked gently, though he already knew the answer from the way Clare's face hardened at the words. She nodded once, sharp and bitter, then seemed to deflate as the adrenaline left her system. Jake had seen that same exhausted wariness in the faces of other women who had learned that love could become a weapon in the wrong hands, that the person who promised to protect you could become the person you most needed protection from. "He doesn't want Lily," Clare said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to hurt me, and she's the most effective way to do that. The custody battle was just another way to control me, to keep me trapped in a life that was slowly killing everything good about me. When I finally found the courage to leave, he made it clear that he would never stop trying to drag me back." The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam, and Jake realized he was the first person Clare had trusted with the full truth of her situation. The pieces of Clare's story began assembling themselves in Jake's mind. The expensive clothes worn too long, the careful way she managed resources, the constant vigilance that never quite left her eyes. She was a refugee from a war most people would not recognize as such, someone who had learned that safety was a luxury that could be revoked without warning. The drive to Millbrook had not been a journey toward something but an escape from something else entirely. "How did you find Sarah's letter?" Jake asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Clare's smile was sad and complicated, filled with the weight of coincidences that might not have been coincidental at all. She disappeared into the guest room and returned with a manila folder thick with papers, medical records, therapy notes, and correspondence that painted a picture of someone who had been fighting battles on multiple fronts. "I was in treatment," Clare said simply, and Jake understood immediately which kind of treatment she meant. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress from the divorce, and everything that came before it. The hospital had a pen pal program for patients who were struggling with similar issues. Sarah was my assigned correspondent during the worst 3 months of my life. She probably saved me from doing something stupid and permanent. The letters Sarah had written filled 24 pages, and reading them was like hearing his wife's voice again after 2 years of silence. But these were not the careful, optimistic words Sarah had shared with Jake during her illness. These were raw and honest, and filled with fears she had never expressed at home. She wrote about her terror of leaving Jake and Emma alone, her guilt about the financial burden of her treatment, her desperate hope that they would find a way to be happy without her. But Sarah had also written about Jake with a love so fierce and complete it made his chest ache with recognition. She described his kindness, his quiet strength, his ability to fix things that seemed beyond repair. She worried that his grief would consume him, that he would retreat so far into himself that Emma would lose both parents instead of just one. In her final letter, Sarah had made Clare promise to check on them if she ever found herself in the position to do so. "She knew," Clare whispered, watching Jake's face as he read the last pages of his wife's correspondence. "Somehow she knew I would need you as much as you might need me. She planned this, Jake. Not the timing or the details, but the possibility. Sarah gave me your address as a gift, but she gave you my friendship as a gift too. She just trusted us to figure out how to unwrap it." The revelation changed everything and nothing all at once. Jake understood now why Clare had seemed so familiar with their routines, why she fit so naturally into the spaces Sarah had left empty. She had been hearing about their lives for months before Sarah died, learning their rhythms and preferences through second-hand observation. But understanding Sarah's intentions did not necessarily make those intentions welcome, and Jake found himself resenting his wife's posthumous matchmaking, even as he appreciated her concern. The crisis came when Jake received a call about his garage facing foreclosure. He had been managing mounting debts since Sarah's medical bills, and the business had been struggling without his full attention. The bank wanted $15,000 within 30 days, or they would seize the property. Jake had hidden this crisis for months, hoping somehow to find a solution that would not require admitting his failure to provide security for Emma. "How much do you need?" Claire asked quietly when she overheard his panicked phone conversation with the bank. Jake's pride flared at the offer of help, even as his practical mind calculated the impossibility of his situation. "I don't need charity," he said sharply, but Claire's expression remained steady and determined. "It's not charity. It's investment in a friend. And besides, Sarah made me promise to help if you ever needed it. This counts." Claire disappeared and returned with a checkbook, writing out the exact amount needed to save the garage. But Jake's acceptance of her financial rescue felt like surrender, like admitting that he could not protect his family or honor his promises to his dead wife. The confrontation that followed was painful and necessary. Jake accused Claire of treating him like a charity project, someone to be fixed and improved by her superior resources and education. Claire fought back with the fury of someone who had been systematically undermined by a previous partner, refusing to accept Jake's self-destructive pride as protection of his dignity. The argument escalated until both children were crying and the future of their fragile family seemed to hang in the balance. "You're going to lose everything because you're too stubborn to accept help," Claire said finally, her voice breaking with frustration and fear. "Emma is going to lose her home, the last place she has memories of her mother, because you would rather fail alone than succeed with support. How is that honoring Sarah's memory?" The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Jake realized he was repeating patterns that had nothing to do with Sarah's wishes, and everything to do with his own fear of being vulnerable again. Accepting Claire's help meant acknowledging that he cared about her enough to risk dependence, enough to trust that she would not use his weakness against him the way Richard had used Claire's vulnerabilities as weapons. Emma's intervention changed everything. His 8-year-old daughter stepped between the arguing adults and declared with devastating simplicity, "I don't care about money or pride or any of that grown-up stuff. I just want us to be a family. Claire and Lily make us happy, and if you send them away because you're scared, I'll never forgive you." The honesty in her voice cut through Jake's defensive barriers like nothing else could have managed. The weeks that followed were a careful reconstruction of trust and partnership. Jake accepted Claire's financial help, but insisted on treating it as a loan with formal repayment terms. More importantly, they began talking honestly about their fears and expectations, about what it meant to build a family from the wreckage of previous losses. Claire shared more details about her marriage to Richard, about the systematic emotional abuse that had convinced her she was worthless without his approval and protection. Jake told Claire about his guilt over Sarah's death, his conviction that a better husband would have found a way to save her, his terror that caring for someone else would somehow betray the memory of his first love. The conversations were painful but necessary, clearing space for something new to grow between them without the weight of unexamined assumptions and unspoken fears. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but unmistakable. Jake found himself looking forward to Claire's opinions on mechanical problems, discovering that her artistic training gave her insights into design and function that complemented his practical experience. Claire began offering suggestions for improving the garage's customer service and organization, her business background helping them develop systems that increased both efficiency and profitability. But it was the domestic routines that convinced Jake their partnership could work long-term. Claire's cooking filled the house with smells that reminded him of childhood comfort, without trying to replicate Sarah's specific recipes. Emma and Lily's friendship deepened into something that looked increasingly like sisterhood, complete with shared secrets, coordinated mischief, and fierce mutual loyalty. Most importantly, the careful politeness that had characterized their early interactions gradually gave way to the kind of comfortable familiarity that allowed for disagreement without fear of abandonment. The proposal came during breakfast on a Tuesday morning when Lily asked directly whether Jake was going to be her new daddy. "Would you like that?" Jake asked, kneeling down to meet her eyes while Emma watched with intense attention. Lily nodded solemnly, then looked at her mother with the particular wisdom that children sometimes displayed about adult emotions. "Mama needs a husband who's nice to her," she announced with devastating simplicity. "And Emma needs a new mama who won't go away." Jake reached into his pocket and withdrew the simple gold band he had been carrying for 3 days, unsure of when or how to present it. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had raised 5 children during the Depression and understood that love was measured in daily acts of kindness rather than grand romantic gestures. It was not the engagement ring Clare might have expected, but it carried the weight of family history and the promise of belonging somewhere permanent. "Clare Matthews," Jake said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Will you marry me and help me raise these 2 troublemakers who seem to think they know better than we do about what makes a family?" The proposal was delivered with a smile that encompassed both children, acknowledging their role in bringing their parents to this moment of decision. Claire's answer came not in words, but in action. She stood and kissed Jake with the kind of desperate relief that spoke of someone who had finally found safe harbor after years of navigating dangerous waters. Emma and Lily cheered with the uninhibited joy of children whose world had suddenly become more secure, more predictable, more filled with the possibility of permanent happiness. The kitchen filled with laughter and planning, and the particular energy that came from a family that was finally confident about its future. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the backyard garden Sarah had planted during her last spring. The ceremony was small and simple, attended by neighbors who had become genuine friends and Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose presence served both as blessing and official documentation that the Morrison-Matthews family had achieved the stability they needed. Emma served as ring bearer, while Lily scattered rose petals with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important responsibility. Jake wore his best suit, the one he had bought for Sarah's funeral, and never expected to wear for a happier occasion. Claire chose a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes and made her look younger than she had since arriving in Millbrook. But the most striking thing about both of them was the absence of the careful wariness that had characterized their interactions for months. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had stopped questioning whether they deserved happiness and had begun focusing on how to build it together. The vows they exchanged were written together during long conversations about the kind of marriage they wanted to create. They promised to honor Sarah's memory while building something new and different. They committed to protecting each other and their children from the forces that might threaten their family's peace. Most importantly, they pledged to choose each other daily, recognizing that love was not a feeling, but a decision that required constant renewal. "I promise to fix whatever breaks in our life together," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned that some repairs required more than mechanical skill. "And I promise to let you fix the things I cannot handle alone, because that's what partners do for each other." Claire's vows spoke of finding home in people rather than places, of learning to trust again after betrayal, of building a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The reception was held in the garage that had brought them together, transformed for the evening with lights and flowers and the kind of simple decorations that spoke of love rather than money. The children danced with abandon, while the adults shared stories and laughter, and the particular satisfaction that came from witnessing love triumph over circumstances that might have destroyed lesser connections. When Tom Bradley offered a toast to "the family that proved love can fix anything," there was not a dry eye in the small gathering. The months that followed the wedding brought challenges faced together rather than in isolation. Richard Sterling made one final attempt to disrupt their peace, hiring investigators to document Jake's financial situation and Claire's mental health history in preparation for a renewed custody challenge. But his efforts were thwarted by the simple reality that the Morrison-Matthews family was genuinely happy and stable, protected by community support and legal safeguards that proved more resilient than money and manipulation. Claire's official adoption of Emma was finalized on the same day Jake's adoption of Lily received court approval, creating legal bonds to match the emotional ones that had been growing for over a year. The children celebrated by insisting on a family portrait that would document their official status as sisters, complete with matching dresses and serious expressions that dissolved into giggles before the photographer could capture them. The garage business evolved as well, expanding to include the art restoration services Clare had begun offering to local museums and private collectors. Her expertise in conservation techniques proved surprisingly compatible with Jake's mechanical skills, and they discovered a shared talent for bringing damaged, beautiful things back to life. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond financial success, providing daily metaphors for their own journey from brokenness to wholeness. What began as individual healing gradually grew into something larger and more significant. Clare developed the idea for the Sarah Morrison Memorial Arts and Healing Program, teaching bracelet making while providing safe spaces for people to share experiences of loss, recovery, and hope. The first workshop was held in their garage on a Saturday morning in November, attended by 12 people ranging in age from 8 to 73. Participants included a recent widow, a teenager whose parents were divorcing, a veteran dealing with combat-related trauma, and several other community members who simply wanted to learn a new skill while supporting a worthy cause. Clare led the technical instruction, while Jake provided practical assistance, and Emma and Lily served as enthusiastic helpers and conversation facilitators. The success of that initial workshop exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months, the program had expanded to include monthly workshops at the hospital, weekly sessions at the senior center, and special programs for school groups dealing with loss or trauma. Clare found herself invited to speak at conferences about community-based healing, sharing Sarah's story and their family's journey from individual grief to collective action. But she always emphasized that the program's power came from ordinary people's willingness to care for each other through shared creative work. 1 year after the program's founding, Jake stood in his garage-turned-community center watching Clare lead a workshop for families affected by military deployment. The space that had once been his private refuge from the world was now filled with laughter and conversation, and the quiet concentration that came from people absorbed in meaningful work. Sarah's original dream of creating connection through handmade objects had evolved into something larger and more impactful than any of them could have imagined. The transformation was complete, but not finished, because meaningful work was never really complete. Each workshop brought new participants with new stories and new needs, requiring constant adaptation and growth from everyone involved. The Morrison-Matthews family had learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that became more meaningful when shared with others who understood the complexities of rebuilding life after loss. Standing in the doorway between his garage and his house, Jake could see Clare working patiently with a young father whose wife had died in a car accident, teaching him to create a bracelet that would help his toddler daughter remember her mother's love. Emma was helping an elderly man whose arthritis made fine motor work difficult, while Lily sat with a teenage girl whose depression had made her feel disconnected from everyone around her. Each interaction was small and ordinary, but together they represented the kind of healing Sarah had envisioned when she first began making bracelets during her own darkest hours. The evening concluded with the traditional circle sharing, where participants could speak about their experiences or simply listen to others' reflections on the day's work. A woman who had been attending workshops for over a year talked about how the program had helped her rebuild confidence after a devastating divorce. A teenager shared that making bracelets had given him a way to honor his grandfather's memory while connecting with other people who understood loss. But the most powerful testimony came from Emma, who had been asked to explain why she enjoyed helping with the workshops. "I like seeing people remember how to be happy," she said with the simple clarity that characterized all her important observations. "When they first come here, they look broken inside, like nothing will ever be good again. But then they start making things with their hands, and they start talking to other people who understand, and pretty soon they're smiling again. It's like watching something grow back after it got cut down." As the last participants departed, and the family began cleaning up for the evening, Jake found himself thinking about the conversation he had shared with Sarah during her final weeks. She had been worried about what would happen to their small family after her death, concerned that Jake and Emma would retreat so far into themselves that they would miss opportunities for future happiness. She had made him promise to remain open to possibilities he could not yet imagine, to trust that love could grow in forms he might not recognize, but should not reject. Sarah could never have predicted the specific details of how that promise would be fulfilled. The arrival of Clare and Lily, the marriage that began as practical necessity and grew into genuine partnership, the transformation of their private grief into public healing. But she had understood the essential truth that would guide everything that followed. Broken things could be made beautiful again when people chose to care for each other rather than protecting themselves from further pain. The Morrison-Matthews family had honored Sarah's memory not by preserving her life exactly as it had been, but by allowing her values and dreams to evolve into new forms that served broader purposes. The garage that had once been Jake's sanctuary of solitude had become a place where dozens of people found community and hope. The bracelet-making skills Sarah had developed during her illness had become the foundation for a program that touched hundreds of lives. Most importantly, the love she had shared with Jake and Emma had multiplied rather than diminished, expanding to encompass Clare and Lily and everyone who found healing in their welcoming family circle. Standing in his transformed garage, as his wife and daughters finished organizing supplies for the next day's work, Jake felt the profound satisfaction that came from understanding his life's purpose with complete clarity. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by people who had chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their individual losses. Sarah's presence was no longer a source of pain, but a blessing that continued to create miracles in forms she had never lived to see, but had somehow made possible through her faith in love's power to heal and transform. The bracelet that started it all, the one Lily had carried into his garage 3 years ago, now hung in a place of honor above Clare's workstation, no longer precious because it preserved memory, but valuable because it had created hope. It was no longer an ending, but a beginning. Proof that some gifts continue, giving long after their creators have moved beyond the reach of gratitude. Sarah Morrison's legacy was not trapped in the past, but alive in the present, growing stronger with each person who learned that broken hearts could be mended when people chose to care for each other without reservation or fear. The little girl who had rushed into his garage, calling "Dad," had brought more than just herself and her mother. She had brought the future, messy and complicated, and more beautiful than any of them had dared to imagine when their individual stories of heartbreak first began to weave together into something larger than the sum of their separate sorrows. Love had indeed proven stronger than loss, hope more powerful than fear, and family more about choice than biology. Sarah Morrison would have been proud.